So to introduce Miss Vincent, Isabel Vincent is an award-winning investigative reporter for the New York Post. Previously, she worked as a South America bureau chief for Canada's Globe and Mail based in Rio de Janeiro. She's also covered war in Africa and in the Balkans, with work appearing in the New Yorker, the New York Times Magazine, and Time, among other publications. She is the author of 7 nonfiction books, including Bodies and Souls, The Tragic Plight of 3 Jewish Women Forced into Prostitution in the Americas, which won the National Jewish Book Award in Canada. So her book, Hitler's Silent Partners, Swiss Banks, Nazi Gold, and the Pursuit of Justice, won the Yad Vashem Award for Holocaust History. Ms. Vincent is a fellow at Massey College and the University of Toronto. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Isabel Vincent. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and it's a real honor to be speaking to all of you. I'm a great fan of the museum. I've gone several times, and this is really moving for me. Thank you. I guess as we could go to the first slide, and I'll just get right into it. So my book is about Ida and Louise Cook, who are 2 ordinary, extraordinary heroines. And there they are. Ida is on the left. She's the younger sister, and Louise, the older sister by about 2 years, is on the right. And this photo was taken about 1923. So they're born in different parts of England. Their father was a tax inspector. So they lived in various places and grew up in Northumberland County. They actually grew up in Alnwick, where they went to school at a private school across from the castle where Harry Potter, where all the Harry Potter films were filmed. I thought that was interesting when I found out. So Ida and Louise, at about this time in the photograph, become opera fans, and so this is about 1923. So the story is that they become opera fans. They befriend some of the biggest divas of their time, including Amelita Galli-Curci and later Rosa Ponselle. And among the people they befriend is also Clemens Krauss, who was a Viennese conductor, very promising Viennese conductor, who was a protege of Richard Strauss's. And he was also Hitler's favorite conductor. And what I mean by that is that Hitler put him in charge of the Munich Opera, which Munich in the Third Reich was to be like the centerpiece, the great center of Third Reich culture. And Clemens Krauss asked them to please help him save some of his Jewish musicians and scholars, which they did. And they saved 29 people on their own. And the question I always get asked is, how did you find out about them? A friend of a friend went to Yad Vashem in Jerusalem and found the memorial to Ida and Louise, who were made righteous among the nations in 1965, among the first women to be given the distinction, and around the time that Raoul Wallenberg and Oscar Schindler were made righteous among the nations. But they've fallen through history, and it's sort of a favorite theme of mine: women who have fallen through history. And I did a lot of work on this when I worked on my book Bodies and Souls, which is about Jewish prostitutes who were trafficked from shtetls in Russia and Poland to mainly Brazil and Argentina, South Africa, some to New York, between 1867 and 1939. And I'll just briefly digress there. Because I was a correspondent in Brazil, I'd heard about these women, and I visited their cemetery, which was located in a shanty town where drug traffickers had torn up some of the graves to hide their weapons and drugs. And this was about 2005 that I went and started to do the research. And the Jewish community, because they were prostitutes at the time in like 1916 when they founded the cemetery, wanted nothing to do with them. So these women formed their own synagogue, and couldn't get a rabbi to officiate, but did have a cantor. And so the most moving thing for me in the story was that these women could only returned to being Jewish in death. And so the last president of their society, which was called the Society of Truth, Rebecca Friedman, always volunteered to do the purification ceremony, the Tahara ceremony on her dead sisters, as she called them, when they died. So that's a little bit to explain about how, you know, I don't know if I look for these stories, but they always really move me. And this was when I chanced upon this story of Ida and Louise, it was the same kind of thing. It's like they've been forgotten by history, and they did, you know, they did an incredible thing. So we can move to the next slide, please, Liz. And this is Amelita Gali Curci. And again, we're still in 1923, which is when the sisters discover opera. And we can play like a minute of the first soprano that they heard singing Un bel di Vedremo from Madame Butterfly, and it just blew them away. And
okay. Oh, I'm sorry.
yeah, just like, we'll just do a minute, because to get
Okay.
a sense of her voice.
Sure. Now, I want to tell everybody the sound is very low. That's because it's a very old recording, and it is up as high as I can make it. So I'll just play about a minute.
So that's Amelita Gali Curci. And, you know, we're talking about like the early 1920s when these divas were like the Kim Kardashians of their day. They were like the biggest celebrities. And, you know, going through the newspapers of the time, you know, when Amelita Gali Curci shows up in London in, I think it was in 1924, for her debut at the Royal Albert Hall. So she did a song cycle. She didn't do opera because she only did opera at the Metropolitan Opera in New York. It was a big deal. It was on the front pages of all of the newspapers. Ida and Louise, who had been exposed to opera and had now become regulars, standing outside the Royal Opera House at Covent Garden to get the cheap seats, the so-called gallery seats, all of a sudden decided they needed tickets to all 4 of Gali Curci's performances at the Royal Albert Hall. So after the last performance, they summon up the nerve to go backstage and meet her. And they ask her, well, where can we hear you sing opera? And she says, only in New York City. And so Ida on the spot says, well, then that's where we're gonna go. And they save up for 2 years. They don't eat lunch. They walk to work. They save their pennies because they're making like, I think they're making like £2 a week as secretaries in the British law courts. So they were both clerks at the time. So they save their money. They save £100 each for the ship's passage and for their time in New York. And at the time, Gali Curci says, well, if you can do it, then, you know, I'll give you tickets to all of my performances. So the reason I include this story in the book is because it shows their, you know, their sense of sacrifice and the fact that if they put their mind to something, they're going to do it. And this aids them later when Clemence Krauss says to them, well, I need you to save these Jewish musicians for me. Can you do it? And they're like, yeah, no problem. Without ever having met a Jew, without really understanding what the obstacles would be. So in the same way, they did this with Amelita Gali Curci, and they show up in New York City in January 1927. And on the ship, they're telling people the story of, you know, what they're doing. And somebody tells the New York Times. So when they arrive, a Times reporter calls them in their hotel and, you know, immortalizes them in like the first paragraph. It's on the front page of the Times, that these 2 women have come to New York to hear opera. And the opening paragraph of that story goes something like this. Ida and Louise Cook members of the British working girl class, comma, blonde, comma. And I just thought it was just, you know, such a funny description of them. And they go to all of her performances. They become best friends with Gali Curci and her husband, Homer Samuels. We can move on to the next slide, please. So, I mean, this is proof. When I was doing my research at the archives in London, the Victoria and Albert Museum archives, where Ida and Louise donated their papers, I come across this letter, and you can see the date on it is October 16th, 1931. And I open the letter, and these perfectly preserved leaves come out. And this is this is Amelita Gali Curci writing the sisters from the Catskills, where she had this magnificent home. And years after they met her, Ida and Louise were regulars in High Mount, New York, at this home. So I just thought it was so magical finding these leaves in this letter after what my math is bad, but after decades, they were still there. One word about the archives is that they were sort of disappointing in that there were a few letters that people had written to Ida and Louise, but there wasn't a lot more information. What there were mainly opera records and programs to all of the performances they had gone to. But at one point, Louise, who was sort of a lifelong bureaucrat, burned all of the archives that had to do with the people that they helped save, and nobody really knows why. At first, I thought, I'm dealing with two spies. You know, Louise teaches herself German at sort of lightning speed so she can communicate with the refugees that they're working with. They rent a flat in central London at a place where all these MI6 agents had flats, and where the Free French set up an office. So de Gaulle was going there after he was in exile. But I couldn't find anything else to sort of justify that. And when I spoke to people who knew the sisters, they said, oh no, they weren't working for the government. They had their own relief effort, which I'll get to, and we could go to the next slide, please, Liz. So this is Clemens Krauss, who starts them on their mission to save these Jewish musicians, and we can play a few seconds of him. I think he is conducting the Vienna Philharmonic here. We're good, thank you. So he's a character, Krauss, like very ambitious man. When he sees that the Nazis are getting rid of a lot of conductors, a lot of very highly, very important conductors, either because they're Jewish or they're insisting upon playing sort of the so-called degenerate modern works. I mean, it's amazing how, doing the research on this book, which took me 5 years, it was amazing to see just how much the Nazi Party was concerned with what operas would be played all over Germany and then all over the Third Reich. So Krauss, who's very ambitious, sort of sees an opportunity to rise through the ranks. And he's a very complex man. So in my research, I find that his secretary in Munich is sending a letter to Hitler's secretary, Martin Bormann, asking for the Jewish apartments that were vacated after Jews were forced to leave Munich. And he needs the apartments because he's bringing over some of the biggest Austrian musicians and singers from Austria and from other parts of Germany. And he complains in the letters that, they're in temporary housing and hotels, and living with other people, and he really needs those apartments. So the same man who's asking for the abandoned Jewish apartments is also talking to Ida and Louise and setting them on their relief work. And the way they do it is that Krauss puts on operas on the weekend in different parts of the Third Reich. So Munich, Berlin, in places where he had influence. Ida and Louise travel on the weekends. And I should mention that by 1936, Ida is no longer a clerk. She's now a writer of romantic fiction. She gets her first book deal, and writing under the pseudonym Mary Burchell, she writes about 200 Harlequin type romances in her lifetime. And so she suddenly starts to make money in 1936, and she uses part of her royalties in order to help bring over some of these Jewish scholars and musicians. But so beginning around that time, Krauss is putting on these operas, and so they have the excuse to travel to the Third Reich, obviously before the war starts. And so during the day, they're interviewing their prospective refugees, and at night, they're attending opera. And so one of the things that they do during the day, in addition to interviewing the refugees and finding ways for them to come over to England, so there were two ways. One was many of the refugees had quota numbers for the United States, but they would have to wait a couple of years. And because the situation was getting worse for Jews with the Nuremberg laws in the Third Reich, they couldn't stay. I mean, they were worried they were going to be sent to a concentration camp. So Ida and Louise have to find guarantors for those people in England, and they guarantee some of the refugees on their own. And then Ida starts to speak before all of these congregations to get them to pool their funds to guarantee a couple or a family. So that was one way they got people out. People who didn't have quota numbers, they arranged for them to get domestic visas to come to England, or they got their children on kinder transports. So the unaccompanied children would come on their own, and then they would wait for their parents. I mean, sometimes this didn't happen because the parents either were arrested or, I found one instance in my research where the foster parents who had kept some of the kids didn't want to give them up to their parents after the parents showed up in England, which was not uncommon. And the other way they got people out were on student visas for England. But so they were actively doing this. One of the things that they did when they were interviewing people was they were collecting their jewelry and fur coats, because often people couldn't, I think people could leave you could leave at that time, but you could only take with you 10 Reichsmarks. You had to abandon, you had to leave everything behind. You had to give up your business, and you had to declare all your income. So a lot of people had converted their assets into jewelry, into furs, things they could transport. So they would give these to Ida and Louise, who would sort of plaster the jewelry on their dresses. And this was amazing to me. So they were wearing these like cheap Marks and Spencer dresses, and they figured that if they just plastered all the jewelry on it, it would just look fake. And they got away with it over and over again. And they had this whole routine set up that if they were caught, they would just revert to what they called their nervous British spinster act. And they would say, oh yes, we're carrying all this jewelry, but we don't trust anybody in England to hold on to it. So we're going to wear it, and we're going to carry it in our purse, and we need it because we're going to the opera and we have to look nice. So it was like a military operation. They would collect people's fur coats, and they would rip out the German and Austrian labels, and they came prepared with British labels that they would take from women on the street in London. They would ask them if they could rip out the labels of their coats. They would sew the labels on the coats like during the day, like before they went to the opera, and then they would wear the coats and the jewelry to the opera so that it looked legitimately like it was their stuff. And Krauss had told them that the best way to, hide was to hide in plain sight at these hotels that were frequented by, some of the some of the biggest Nazis. So at one point, the foreign minister von Ribbentrop sees Louise at at one of these hotels in Berlin, and according to Louise, he gives her the glad eye. So he's, sort of interested in Louise at that time. We can go to the next slide, please. So that's Clemens Krauss, and he's very arrogant. He's good looking, and one of the people I spoke to who knew Ida and Louise said that both of them were so in love with him or so infatuated with him that they would have done anything he asked. And certainly Ida, in her letters to Yad Vashem, really, brings up the fact that she hopes that he and his wife, and I think we can move to the next slide, please, so we can show his wife. That's Viorica Ursuliak, who was a soprano and probably Richard Strauss's favorite soprano. He wrote Arabella for her. So in her letter to Yad Vashem, Ida is saying, they were really the mainstay of our whole operation, and we hope that they are honored. Like Schindler, Krauss is complex. I mean, I think he's a hero, but he's a very complex hero. I mean, Schindler was a war profiteer who made money through slave labor. Yes, he saved people in the same way. I mean, Krauss is an imperfect, very complex man, but he did risk his life, and he did risk his wife's life to save the Jews that they ended up saving. One of the other ways that they transferred cash across a border was by essentially laundering opera tickets. So there were letters that I found in the Munich archives where Ida Cook is asking Clemens Krauss's secretary, can you please reserve for us 80 tickets for your next opera? I'm like, what's she doing with 80 tickets? Well, what she did was she would buy these tickets. Sometimes she would bring people over from, their opera friends from Covent Garden. And she would get the would-be refugees to pay for everything, for all of their lodging and the tickets. And the refugees would only get that money back once they had crossed a border. So no money crosses a border, but they get their assets back because they paid for the tickets. I thought, it was completely genius. So next slide, please. So this is the first time that Ida and Louise meet Krauss and his wife, and it's outside Covent Garden in 1934. And this is just before the premiere of Arabella in London. And Ida's so nervous. She doesn't quite know it's Clemens Krauss, but then she waits to see somebody else get his autograph, and then realizes that it's him. And the first picture she takes of him is so out of focus that she wants to go back and do another picture. So this is the picture that she takes a couple of days later. She summons up the courage to do this. And then she goes to Salzburg that summer and tries to track the couple down in order to get them to autograph the picture. And that's when Ursuliak says to her, will you help me with one of my friends? And because her English is not great, she only speaks German. Ida and Louise don't quite understand what she means, but one of her friends, the friend that she's talking about, is a woman named Mietja Meyer-Liesman, who is a very important opera scholar in Frankfurt. And Mietja, by this time, by 1934, has lost her job. Her husband's business has been Aryanized. And they're looking for an escape. They're looking to go somewhere else. So Mietja goes to London on a lecture tour, and Ida and Louise don't quite know what to do with her. So they take her around, show her various sites and various churches. And at one point, Ida says to Mietja, tell me, are you Catholic or are you Protestant? And Mietja looks at them and she says, I thought you knew I'm Jewish. And they're like, they don't know what that means. They don't understand that to be Jewish at that time in Nazi Germany is not a good thing. And so they sit down, they try to figure out how to get her to England, but they still don't quite understand in their civil service brains. They don't understand the concept of the Nuremberg laws. So Ida says, okay, well, we'll just have to come to Frankfurt and figure it out. So they go to Frankfurt, and that's when the full force of everything that's going on with Jews and their, the gradual disenfranchisement of Jews sort of hits them. Ida later goes back to Frankfurt right after Kristallnacht, and that really hits her as well. But on that first trip around 1934, 1935, they begin to see what they need to do to help save people. And then they get all their friends involved. Like, in addition to going and speaking at congregations and trying to get guarantees for people, people contribute in other ways. One friend gives up smoking and gives the saved money to Ida and Louise for postage for the visas for the refugees. So it really becomes this communal effort amongst these women to help save these desperate people. And we can probably go to the next slide, please, Liz. So there's Ida and Louise as older women. One of the things that really that made me want to write this book was their love of music. And one of the scenes that I'd read about in one of Ida's letters. So I should mention that because there was like a paucity of information at the Victoria and Albert Archives, I thought, how am I going to tell this story? So I just figured, Ida was such a writer and such a prolific writer. There has to be correspondence with these divas around the world. And she knew everybody from Amelita Galli-Curci to Ezio Pinza, who was, one of the great stars of the Metropolitan Opera, who was in South Pacific, to Rosa Poncel. She wrote to everybody. So I found, and my greatest find was actually the letters that she wrote to Rosa Poncel that were at the New York Public Library's Lincoln Center branch under, Rosa Poncel's correspondence. And in those letters, Ida explained sort of everything that was going on in their lives. And, this is a woman who wrote 200 books and had time to write these just really long, amazing letters in which she described everything. But getting back to Poncel, who they see for the first time in London in 1929, she becomes a very important character in this story, because Ida and Louise are blown away by this woman's voice. And I think we can go to the next slide, please. And they, going through the war, they promise each other, like they go through the Blitz and survive this, 6 years. And they say to each other, if we get through this, I'm going to go to America, and I want to hear Rosa Poncel sing again. And I guess we can just play a little bit from the Pace Pace aria from La Forza del Destino. So one of the greatest moments that I read about in these letters was after the war. Ida reads that Rosa Poncel has married one of the sons of the mayor of Baltimore. So she writes a letter. On the envelope, she writes Rosa Poncel, Baltimore, USA. And in that letter, she writes to Rosa Poncel about how much she has meant to the two sisters, and how thinking about hearing her voice again sort of gets them to gives them the courage to live through all the horrible things that they're living through. And so after the war, after Poncel gets this letter, she sends a telegram to Ida, and she says she's really moved by the letter, and let's set up a call. So setting up a call in the days when setting up a transatlantic call was like a really big deal, and you had to wait for the operator, they had to ring you back. So Ida decides she's going to assemble all of her friends at her little flat, which one thing I meant to mention about the flat is that the flat, which they originally rent for their little opera soirees, becomes a clearinghouse for their refugees. And at one point, according to one of the letters sent to Yad Vashem, 15 people were living in a one-bedroom flat. So the cooks lived with their parents their whole life. But anyway, they assemble their friends and their opera aficionados at this flat and wait for the phone call, from Rosa Poncel's phone call. And Rosa calls, and then she says, "Do you want me to sing?" And this is such a great moment, is that Ida says, Ida doesn't know quite what to say, but she says yes. And then as she sings, and she sings this aria, the snippet of which we just heard, and Ida passes the phone to each of the 30 people standing in that room so they could hear a little bit of that, what they described as that golden voice. I'm going to stop here because I realize that I'm gone over my half hour, and I will now entertain questions. I mean, I've got a lot more to say, as you can probably tell here, but please ask me anything that you want to know.
Mallory, may I ask you to facilitate the Q&A?
Absolutely. Thank you, Isabel. It was fantastic. I'll have you, if you want to raise the virtual hand, the reaction, that should bump you up too, and it'll make it easier to see you. Does anybody have any questions for Isabel?
I see Howie.
Okay. Physical hand. There we go. Thanks.
I don't have a question. I just like to hear it go on. I'm just so fascinated by this whole story. I mean, fantastic. The research you did, just blown away by it. So as far as I'm concerned, I'll listen longer.
Well, one of the things that was really interesting to me was, how come we don't know about them? Again, I mentioned Schindler, I mentioned Wallenberg. And Ida herself wrote a book in 1950 called We Followed Our Stars, which was about, her interactions with these great divas and with Clemens Krauss. And, it got a little bit of, it got a little bit of press. They came to New York, they were on NPR, they were both interviewed, but then it sort of dies away. At one point, Laurence Olivier, of all people, and it's funny because it shows you how old I am, but my editors on my book were like, when they saw Laurence Olivier, they put in brackets, famous British actor. It's no longer a household name. What do I know? And he said to them, you should really make a movie. So he introduces them to a man named Josh Logan, who many of you probably know as great American producer, director, South Pacific, among other films. And Josh Logan, is totally captivated with their story. And so I found a number of letters that Ida sent to Logan in his papers, which are at the Library of Congress. And at one point, Logan gets somebody to write a treatment about a film about their adventures, and Ida sends him a letter, and it's sort of like this, it's very British, but it's bristling with anger. And it's like, well, this is a great treatment about a story, but it's about our story, but it's not quite true. Because there was a romantic element. Apparently one of the sisters falls in love with somebody. I don't know if it was Clemens Krauss, because actually that treatment isn't part of the correspondence. So Ida says she's going to write her own treatment. So that particular treatment is in the Library of Congress. But her first line of that treatment, and you know, set against the glamour of Hollywood, is, "This is the story of two squares." So the treatment for me was very useful because Ida, I mean, you know, that's not going to be made in Hollywood at that time. But what was interesting for me as somebody who was researching them is that she would describe a scene, and then she would have in brackets, "This really happened." So it was great for me to be able to take information from that, and it became like a jigsaw puzzle, sort of taking, you know, stuff from the letters combined with the treatment, combined with what I was seeing in archives. And I went to archives in Austria, Germany. There was the Yad Vashem papers that were great because people they saved wrote to Yad Vashem and told the whole story of what Ida and Louise had done for them. And using also public records. I mean, I got a great coroner's record from England, which had in great detail the very sad story of what had happened to one of their refugees. I don't want to give it away if you're going to read the book, but it was all documented, you know, down to what he was wearing, what he should have been doing that day, and why he, you know, turned on the, you know, he's saved from going to Auschwitz. His mother dies in Auschwitz, but then, you know, a couple of years in London, he can't really make it in the opera world there. And he decides to kill himself by turning on the gas in his kitchen. And this was all described in the medical examiner's report and included letters from, you know, his employer in London. And it was fascinating. I mean, I love public records because they always tell such a fascinating story. And if you know, and I believe that you can find pretty much anything about anybody if you sort of follow that through. I mean, I work for the Post, and I can never say to my editors, and I learned this the hard way, I can never say to my editors, "Well, I give up, I can't find this." And they're like, you just can't say that. There's always a way to find something if you really try, and then you have to just be resourceful. So I took all of these elements and put them together. And I'm a fellow at the New York Public Library. I have a little office there. It's my like happiest achievement, I think. And I presented this book as I was researching it. And the greatest compliment I got from the librarians there was, "This is like a remarkable piece of epistolary research." And I was like, "Oh, I like that." But it was really sort of, you know, taking these letters that, you know, Ida had sent to all these famous people and just sort of piecing them together with what was going on in the world at that time, and you know, relating it back to what they were doing. I mean, I was lucky enough also to find people who knew them. Not so lucky in finding the descendants of the refugees that they saved, although I did find a couple of people.
Diane, did you still have a question, or did she answer it?
I guess my first reaction, or my reaction after hearing some of these stories of them smuggling out precious jewels and whatever, is, did they ever get the attention of the German authorities?
No, because what they would do, their life became sort of like an opera. It became like part farce, part tragedy. They would go in to the Third Reich through one border, and then they would make sure after their weekend to leave by a different border. So they would fly from Croydon to, you know, I forget where, like Cologne, and then they would leave through sometimes Amsterdam. I mean, it was circuitous, and if you thought about it, it was like they became heroines in their own opera. And, you know, certainly, again, they led these like very staid, sort of boring lives, but they lived through what they did just before the Second World War. They lived these sort of melodramatic, heroic lives. And they also lived through Ida's fiction, because both of them worked on those books. Like the copyright is for both sisters, which is really interesting. But people also told me that they worked together on them. And they were, you know, they came of age in England after the First World War. They were part of a cohort of women known as surplus women because so many men had died, like 750,000 British men had died in that conflict. So they, addressed the fact that they never wanted to marry. As I said earlier, they lived with their parents, but they lived these intense lives through opera, through fiction, and through the stuff that they did to help people just before the war. And their help, one thing that was in the Yad Vashem letters that was very interesting to me is their help never stopped. So when people lost their jobs, when people they had brought over to England lost their jobs in London or were having trouble, Ida and Louise was there to help them. At one point, Mietje Meyer-Leisman, one of their first refugees, the opera scholar, her husband dies after they get to England, and she loses her job at this Finnish school in London. She goes back to live at the cook's apartment for 5 years, and they're like totally okay with that. And with everybody else after the war, the sisters decide they're going to volunteer at a displaced persons camp in near Munich, and they set up a scholarship for opera students in Florence. They finance it, and one of the women whose careers they financed is still living in Los Angeles. I spoke to her quite a bit about the sisters, and she just said that that they were amazing. They were always helping people. So I lost track of what your question was. I'm sorry, but hope I answered it.
All right, since we're a little short on time, I'll have Bill and Moshe go and ask their questions, and we'll see if we can get them answered.
Okay, thank you. First of all, thank you for sharing this incredible story. I really look forward to reading the book. I was intrigued by a scenario that you described where parents of the kinder transport children were able to get to England and then wanted to reclaim their children, but the foster parents pushed back on that. How was that resolved? Was that, did that become a frequent occurrence? I just find that, hard to wrap my head around.
Yeah, me too. I mean, it came up with the deputy conductor, with Krause's deputy conductor, a Polish Jew, who managed to get to, who was like one of the last people that the cooks helped get out of Vienna, and they had sent their young daughter on a kinder transport, and so like a year later, when the parents show up, Ida and Louise have to intervene because they don't want to, the foster parents don't want to give up the kid.
Wow.
I'm like, did that happen? And so I started doing the research, and it happened more often than you would think. I mean, there's a lot of other sad stories where, some of the kids were sexually abused after they got to England, but it wasn't as uncommon as I thought, because like you, I was totally shocked. What do you mean they're not going to give up the kids?
Wow.
So
that's incredible.
So I in that particular instance, Ida and Louise were able to intervene. And again, all these refugees were lucky because they had these two women on side. I mean,
Sure.
Ida was not going to give in to anything. Like she was just a crazy woman. I mean, she didn't take no for an answer.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, Moshe, do you have a quick question?
Yes,
2 minutes, okay.
I was just curious about Krause. You said he was a complex character. Did he do this as a humanitarian gesture? Did he make money out of this? Why did he and his wife behave this way? And what happened to him after the war?
Right. So I think he wanted to save the people who worked with him, because a lot of the people that they ended up saving were in that circle. So his deputy conductor, Georg Melaniak, whose daughter we just spoke about, also Mietje Meyer-Leisman was somebody who knew the Krause and his wife very well. And then, that whole circle of intellectuals and musicians around them. So what happens to him after the war is he never becomes a member of the Nazi Party. I mean, like like Richard Strauss, I mean, they sort of thought the Nazis were a passing phenomenon and they would just tolerate them. I mean, Krauss did more than that. I mean, he actively worked to, become famous, and he was really an opportunist. But after the war, he got in big trouble. He went through a denazification trial in Austria, and the Austrians accused him of treason. And the treason was taking away Austria's most famous singers and sort of opera performers and taking them to Germany. Like, that was sort of unforgivable. And as a result of that, they banned him from conducting in Austria. And this literally killed him. I mean, he would go and do performances around the world, and people would picket and call him a Nazi. And, there was no way for him to really prove, oh, I did this with the cooks, because there were no documents. I mean, he couldn't write it down. And he himself made a point to say to the cooks, you can't write any of this down when we do this. So he had a very sad life. I mean, I don't want to give away what happened to it. It's in the book, what happened to him. But he had a very sad ending.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I muted myself. There we go. Thank you, Isabel, for the talk. Thank you for joining us tonight. This is incredible. It's very telling, as well researched as this topic is, that there's still stories like this that people don't know, and there's still things to learn. So,
For sure. Sure.
yeah, if everybody wants to join me in thanking Isabel for joining us this evening.
Thank
Yes.
you. No, thank
Thank
you.
you.
It's,